"Mouthy little thing who doesn't know her place," Chief Claiborne spat, "right before planning to throw a girl off a cliff like it was just another Southern tradition." She was 18, black, brilliant, and brave enough to say no to his public proposal. But what he didn't know? Her father runs the FBI. Now Claiborne's dirty secrets are bleeding out, and the town that once bowed to his name, now choking on the truth. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments, and don't blink. The ending hits harder than the fall. On a blistering June afternoon, beneath the faded red and white banners of Whitney Memorial High, the entire town gathered like they always had. Folding chairs squeaking beneath heavy denim, church hats shading pale faces, and that old Baptist organ still echoing faintly from the gymnasium speakers. It was graduation day in a corner of Texas that never quite made peace with the new century. There were whispers before it happened. Rumors rippled weeks in advance that Sheriff Charles Claiborne had taken a liking to one of the graduating seniors. Not just any girl. Mabel Harper, 18, black, top of her class, the only student in the whole district accepted into 3 Ivy League schools. Yet still, the only one who had to check her bag at the school entrance each morning. She stood that day in a simple yellow dress, pressed and sleeveless. Her afro was pinned tight, her shoulders square, her chin just slightly tilted toward the sky, like she refused to be weighed down by the heat or the eyes on her. She smiled politely as her name was called, took the stage to accept her diploma, and prepared to step down. But she didn't get the chance. That's when he rose. Sheriff Claiborne, with his wide belt and his silver star catching sunlight like a blade, stepped onto the platform. The crowd parted instinctively, some with respect, others with unease, but no one dared interrupt. He carried a small black box in one hand and a Texas state flag pin on the lapel of his tan uniform. He smiled the smile of a man who believed what came next was his due. "Folks," he began, voice booming through a microphone that wasn't his to use, "this town's known its share of bad apples, but we've also known pride. Today I present to you my bride-to-be." Gasps. Then silence. Then that sickly southern hush where politeness becomes complicity. He turned to Mabel, opened the box, and inside gleamed a modest diamond ring. Nothing extravagant but pointed, symbolic, and deliberate. "Mabel Harper," he said, "will you marry me and become part of a legacy that keeps this town safe, respectable, and united?" A smile sat on his lips, but his eyes, dead cold behind the gleam, dared her to say no. She didn't flinch. Her voice, when it came, didn't tremble or rise. It landed like a verdict. No. The air cracked. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse. It was real. He blinked, laughed nervously. "Now come on, girl. Don't play cute. You know what I meant." She took a single step back and said louder, "No, Sheriff, I'm not your prize. I'm not anyone's damn property." That did it. Claiborne's face turned the color of rusted iron. His hand clenched the ring box so hard the velvet snapped. Someone coughed. Someone else muttered, "Jesus Christ," but no one moved. He dropped the box. "You think you're special, don't you?" he hissed under his breath, the microphone picking it up anyway. "Parading around like you're better than the rest of us? Walking into rooms like your name matters more than mine?" She stared back, steady. "I walk like I've earned it," she replied, "and you walk like it's owed to you." A ripple of stunned silence rolled through the white faces in the crowd. Mabel's classmates froze, some wide-eyed, some ashamed. Principal Hargrove reached for the mic, then hesitated. Sheriff Claiborne turned to the audience with a tight smile, trying to reassert control, but it was too late. The heat in the air had shifted. "You'll regret this," he said through clenched teeth. "Maybe," Mabel answered, "but I won't be owned." It was a rupture, not just in his pride, but in the fragile, unspoken hierarchy of a town that had always let men like Claiborne decide what was normal, what was decent, and what was dangerous. A black girl saying no in public? That wasn't just defiance, it was treason. His hand went to his hip, not for a weapon, but for his phone. He didn't look at her when he muttered the words, "We'll fix this." And just like that he turned and walked off stage, past the confused parents, past the teachers who still hadn't applauded, past the mayor who pretended not to notice. Behind him, Mabel stood tall, holding her diploma with the steadiness of someone who understood exactly what price she'd just invited. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She didn't look back. Because deep down, she knew the real test hadn't started yet. The sheriff wouldn't take that public humiliation and let it rot quietly. Men like him didn't just bruise, they retaliated. What no one in that crowd knew, not even Claiborne himself, was that the girl he just threatened wasn't just a scholarship student or a defiant black teenager. She was the daughter of Douglas Harper, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and she hadn't even begun to fight. The day after the graduation scandal, the heat in Whitney Memorial didn't break. If anything, it got heavier, thicker, with the kind of tension that no weather report ever bothers to mention. The air smelled like gasoline, cedar dust, and something sour beneath the surface of polite society. At first glance, it looked like just another sleepy southern morning, but beneath the quiet, something had already begun to rot. Mabel Harper stood alone near the pumps of a rust-stained Sinclair gas station, 10 miles outside town, the kind of place with one working nozzle, a flickering Budweiser sign in the window, and an old man in a rocking chair who hadn't stood up since Reagan left office. She was waiting for her cousin to pick her up. They were supposed to drive to Austin that afternoon to visit a civil rights museum. Something symbolic, something healing after the storm she'd just created by standing on that graduation stage and saying no. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Hey, Mabel," came the voice. Familiar, but slightly off. "It's Deputy Roy. Listen, sorry to call out of the blue, but your friend Nadine's been in a wreck. Small one. Rear-ended near the logging road. She's asking for you. We're just down the way. I can swing by and take you to her." Mabel blinked. Nadine? She hadn't spoken to her that morning, but she knew Nadine's beat-up Ford was old and the roads were bad. She hesitated. Roy sensed it. "Don't worry. Ain't nothing serious. Just shaken up, you know. I figured you'd want to be there before the tow truck." She glanced back at the gas station. No one was watching. No one ever was. "All right," she said, "but I'll only ride in the back. Don't need any misunderstandings." Roy chuckled through the phone. "Ain't no trouble, sweetheart. You're doing the right thing." 10 minutes later, the sheriff's cruiser rolled up like a wolf in church clothes. Deputy Roy Lasker stepped out first, tall, blond, and built like a man raised on fried catfish and control. His badge caught the sunlight just enough to sting the eyes. Behind the wheel, Officer Dean Tuck offered a slow nod, his sunglasses reflecting the empty stretch of highway behind them. "Hop in," Roy gestured. "Door already open. She's just a mile up the road." Mabel paused. Something in the air shifted. A bird stopped chirping. She caught a glimpse of Dean's knuckles tightening on the steering wheel. Still, she stepped inside. The door clicked shut like a cell block. They didn't drive toward the highway. Instead, they turned south, into the pines. "No traffic up this way," Roy said casually, tapping the dashboard. "Quieter." Mabel glanced at the trees, thick and dry from heat. The road narrowed. The reception died. That's when she knew. She reached for the door. Dean hit the lock. "What the hell is this?" she demanded. Roy didn't smile this time. He just reached down beside him, pulled a black drawstring sack from under his seat, and turned halfway toward her. "Sheriff says you're confused, sweetheart," he muttered. "You embarrassed him. In front of the whole damn town." She started to scream, but Roy was faster. The sack went over her head in one fluid motion. Her arms swung, caught nothing. The next second, zip ties bit into her wrists, hard and cold. "Don't!" she hissed, her voice cracking. "You touch me and—" "You should have known your place, girl." The sentence landed with the force of a boot. It wasn't spoken in anger. It was spoken in expectation, like a ritual passed down through generations of men who never had to answer for the weight of their words. Mabel thrashed, but the more she moved, the tighter the plastic cuffs burned into her skin. She could hear Dean laughing under his breath, low, guttural, hateful. The cruiser picked up speed, gravel spraying beneath its tires. Inside the sack, the world became sound and vibration, the rumble of tires, the rise and fall of heat through the vents. Somewhere in the front, country music played softly. Every so often, Roy's voice cut through the darkness, talking to Dean like they were headed to a barbecue, instead of dragging a teenage girl into the woods. "You think she'll run?" "She won't run when her legs break." Mabel bit her lips so hard she tasted blood. She didn't beg, she didn't cry. She just tried to breathe through fabric that reeked of gasoline and sweat and hate. No Miranda rights, no formal charges, no paperwork. Just a warning. You don't humiliate white power and walk away with your future intact. They drove deeper into the forest, far from any highway, past the broken fences and dry creek beds, into the kind of place even the sheriff's radio refused to reach. The air grew still. Even the trees held their breath. The cruiser slowed as the road gave way to dirt, then stone. They were heading toward the ridge, into that stretch of dead hills and red dust, where screams went unheard and the law never came looking. The road disappeared behind them as the cruiser ground to a halt atop Red Rock Overlook, a wind-swept plateau that sloped into a dead valley of cracked earth and brittle sage. No signs, no fences, no trespassing warnings, just air that stung the lungs and silence that devoured sound. For decades, the locals called it the Edge, not because of its name, but because it was where things ended. Cattle, coyotes, sometimes kids who wandered too far. And now it was Mabel Harper's turn. The car door creaked open. She was yanked out by the wrists, the plastic cuffs cutting deeper as her feet scraped along red gravel. The sack still covered her face, soaked with sweat and breath and fear. She coughed as the dust rose around her. No one said a word. Roy Lasker grunted as he hauled her upright. His hands were shaking, not from effort, from conflict. Dean Tuck stood behind him, arms crossed, chewing a toothpick like it was meat. And stepping out from a second cruiser, boots thudding with authority, came Lieutenant Paul Ellison, older, colder. The kind of white man who didn't speak unless it was final. Paul was the one they called when something had to disappear. Mabel tried to speak through the sack, her voice hoarse from the heat and the fear. "Please, you don't have to do this. I haven't done anything wrong." Ellison didn't blink. "You disrespected a man who keeps this town standing." "I said no to a question," she said, louder now, raw. Dean chuckled. "No girl says no to a man who can give her everything." "I don't want everything," she snapped. "I want out. I want to live my life without being owned by someone old enough to be my father." Roy flinched at that. She caught it, the tremor in his arm as he held her upright. Like, for 1 second, he saw her not as a problem, not as a symbol, but as a human being. "You don't have to do this, Roy," she said softly. "You can still stop it." Paul barked, "Do it!" Roy's mouth opened. "Maybe I said. "Do it!" Ellison stepped closer. "You want your wife and baby to wake up in the middle of the night to a burned porch? Because that's what happens to men who hesitate." The breeze shifted, the dry heat swirling dust like smoke. The valley below shimmered under the weight of it all, and still, the bag stayed on her face. "I'm not some damn lesson," Mabel cried. "I have rights." "You had rights," Dean interrupted. You gave those up the second you embarrassed a man in uniform." Mabel's knees buckled. Her wrists bled. Her chest heaved. "I'm the daughter of—" She tried to scream, but the words never came. Paul's fist struck the back of her head. Fast, blunt, final. She crumpled. Roy caught her before she fell. Not out of kindness, out of obligation. "Let's finish this," Ellison muttered. Together, they dragged her to the cliff's edge. The sun hit its peak above them, casting no shadows to hide behind. A single hawk circled overhead, indifferent. Mabel stirred. Even unconscious, her mouth moved. Fragments of names, perhaps her mother's, perhaps her own. Roy hesitated again. "She's just a kid," he whispered. Ellison leaned in, his voice low and deadly. "She's not a kid. She's an example." Dean nodded. "The kind you only have to make once." They let go. Her body dropped. The wind howled. The valley below waited like an open grave. But fate, or something harder to name, intervened. A gnarled branch jutted out from the cliffside, the kind you'd never notice unless you were falling. It caught the edge of the sack, twisted the weight, changed the angle. Instead of a clean plunge, she ricocheted off a ledge, her shoulders slamming into a rock face, slowing the fall. She hit ground. Not dead, not safe, but breathing. Above, the men looked down. Dust clouded the edge. "Is she dead?" Dean asked. Roy didn't answer. He couldn't see. But Ellison already turned back toward the cruiser. "She's gone," he said. "That's all that matters." And just like that, they vanished, taking silence with them. Below, tangled in roots and bleeding into the dust, Mabel Harper opened her eyes. Not to light, not to hope, just to pain, and to the echo of a sentence still ringing in her ears. "We are the law." Below the cliff, where heat baked the bones of the land and vultures circled like they'd been summoned, Mabel Harper's body lay twisted among rocks and dust. There was no mercy in the fall, just a miscalculation. A branch, a shift in weight and pain that radiated through her ribs like wildfire. She woke in pieces, not with a gasp or a scream, but with a cough, dry, cracked, and buried beneath a sack still soaked in blood and sweat. Her mouth tasted like copper and dirt. Her head pulsed with the memory of a blow that was meant to erase her. She couldn't see, couldn't move her arms. Her hands were still zip-tied behind her back, the plastic cutting deeper with each twitch. Her right leg burned, and something sharp pierced her side whenever she breathed too deeply. A broken rib, maybe two. The heat pressed against her like judgment. And still, she was alive, barely. Breathing shallow, she rolled onto her side. Every movement was punishment. Every inch of grit that dug into her skin reminded her that the men who threw her weren't guessing. They were certain she wouldn't get up, certain no one would find her, certain that if the fall didn't kill her, the heat would. But they didn't know her. She twisted again, shoulder grinding against stone, and forced her body upright. Her vision was still black, the sack clinging to her face like a death mask. But she could hear the rustling wind, the distant chirp of insects, the faint echo of tires that no longer cared where they'd been, and she could think. Slowly, painfully, she raised her knees and dragged herself forward like an animal broken in half. Her wrists throbbed with each shift. Her face scraped against gravel. But inch by inch, she crawled, toward what she didn't know. There was no path, no plan, just the searing need to keep going, to not give them the dignity of her silence. She stopped near a jagged rock and leaned in. Using her cheek, her chin, and what little strength remained in her jaw, she pressed the sack against the stone. Again and again. She scraped until the fibers tore, until the heat hit her raw skin and she could taste open air. And then the light broke in. Not sunlight, just the dimming hue of late afternoon bleeding orange across the cliffs. Her face was swollen, one eye nearly shut. Her lips were cracked, her nose bleeding, but she could see. and what she saw was death, red earth, twisted weeds, cracked limestone, and the long shadow of a cliff that tried to consume her and failed. She collapsed forward, breathed, cried, not from pain, from rage, because in that moment a memory returned, a courtroom, a voice, a woman with fire in her throat and iron in her spine, her mother, Valerie Harper, the civil rights attorney who vanished after exposing a local militia in Texas, a case dismissed. The body never found. The daughter left behind. They called it suicide. They called it convenient. But Mabel remembered the way her mother walked into rooms full of white men who hated her and never blinked. She remembered the smell of court files at the kitchen table, the way her mother once whispered, "They'll fear your voice, baby girl, so don't ever give them silence." And now, lying in the dust of Texas, Mabel realized what she had to do. She had to survive. She had to climb out of the silence they buried her in, and she had to bring their names with her. She pushed herself up again, arms still bound, knees shredded, her breath hitched. She tasted vomit and swallowed it down. Her legs barely worked, but her will dragged them forward. One crawl, another. The sun dipped lower. Somewhere above she heard the faint screech of a hawk, and then, just as she thought the earth might reclaim her, she whispered, "They threw me off thinking I'd disappear. But I remember every damn face. Claiborne, Roy, Dean, Ellison, every one of them. She knew their voices, their hands, their lies. And if she ever stood tall again, she'd name them one by one in front of the whole damn country." She kept crawling, through brush, over stone, past thorn and heat and hopelessness. She left a trail of blood behind her, but it didn't matter. Let them know she didn't die easy. Let them be afraid. By the time the sun brushed the top of the cliffs in a final blaze of orange, Mabel collapsed behind a cluster of low shrubs. Her chest heaved. Her vision swam. And then, hoofbeats. Distant at first, rhythmic, purposeful. She raised her head just enough to see a silhouette near the ridge. A horse, a rider, a figure backlit by the dying sun, coat flapping gently in the breeze. She didn't know who it was, didn't know if it was another man come to finish the job, but she didn't flinch. Because whatever came next, she would face it as the girl they couldn't erase. The rider didn't speak. He dismounted slowly, stepped forward with quiet boots and steady breath. And as the last light disappeared behind the hills, Mabel Harper felt the world shift again, not towards safety, but towards something else entirely, a beginning. The man didn't speak when he approached, just knelt beside her like someone who'd seen too many broken things and knew not to make promises. The dying sun cast a soft glow behind his weathered frame. His beard was speckled with gray, his boots were worn down at the heels, and his horse, an old roan named Dusty, stood nearby, as if trained not to flinch at the smell of blood. He studied the girl in silence, the way her body curled protectively around pain, the dried blood at her temple, the ragged breathing that told him she was still clinging to the edge. There were no roads out here, no tourists, no reason for any teenage girl, especially a black one, to end up half dead at the foot of a dry well in Texas hill country. But the look on his face said he'd seen stranger things in his time. Gently, without force or panic, he lifted her into his arms. Her skin was burning up. Her wrists were still bound. Her leg, twisted awkwardly, dragged across his thigh. But he didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask what she'd done. He just carried her back toward the old barn, where rusted tin creaked in the wind, and the windows had long since surrendered to dust. His name was Ronan Blake. Years ago, folks in this part of the state used to call him Deputy Blake, until the day he testified against 3 of his own, 3 white deputies, who'd beaten a black teenager so badly his own mother didn't recognize him in the hospital. Ronan brought it to Internal Affairs, filed the paperwork, told the truth under oath. The case was closed in under a week. No criminal wrongdoing, they'd said. insufficient evidence, despite the bruises, the missing dashcam footage, and a witness statement Ronan swore had been altered. 2 months later, his wife died in a hit-and-run. No suspect, no arrest. The case, like his career, was left to rot in a drawer somewhere inside the sheriff's office. So Ronan left the force. He bought a patch of land no one wanted, where the soil was too dry and the ghosts too loud. He took in broken animals, he stopped answering his phone, and he tried, quietly, to forget the badge that once meant something. Until today. Today, the ghosts came back in the shape of a black girl with blood in her hair and a silence that screamed louder than sirens. He placed her on an old cot inside the barn, wrapped a blanket around her, cut the zip ties with a rusty pair of wire cutters. He dabbed at the blood, cleaned the wounds, splinted her leg with strips of oak and denim. Still, she didn't wake, but she breathed. Outside, Dusty snorted and stamped the ground, sensing the storm that had no clouds. Ronan sat beside her in a chair that creaked like it might protest his weight. He didn't pray, he didn't cry, but his jaw tightened with a kind of fury that only quiet men carry, one born not from surprise but recognition. He'd seen this before, different face, different town, same cruelty. Hours passed. The light drained from the cracks in the wood, and just as night swallowed the hills, Mabel stirred. She didn't scream, didn't flail or beg. Her eyes opened slowly, darting across the barn, the flickering lamp, the bandage on her wrist, and then to the man. "Where?" she rasped, her voice a ghost dragged through gravel. "You're safe," he said. Her eyes narrowed. "That what the last one said?" He nodded once, like he expected the suspicion. "Name's Ronan. Found you near the well out back. You were near death." She tried to sit up, winced. "You call the cops?" His answer came fast and flat. "No." "Why not?" Ronan leaned forward, voice low. "Because I used to be one, and I know exactly what kind of cops we're dealing with out here." The silence that followed was heavier than the barn's walls. Mabel studied him, the way he moved, the way he didn't ask too much, or stare too long, or pretend this was anything but what it was, a rescue, with no savior complex. She whispered, "They left me for dead. Thought I was just some poor black girl with no name." "You're not," he said. "No," she whispered again. I'm not." He didn't press her for more, just got up, walked to the table and poured water into a chipped mug. She drank with shaking hands, and for the first time in hours, her body stopped bracing for the next blow. The cot creaked as she lay back down. Her voice, though dry, cracked with the weight of memory. "You didn't rescue me to save me. You rescued me because you saw what no one else would, that I was still human." Ronan didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, the world outside may have been filled with uniforms and shotguns and men who believed they were untouchable, but in here, under a broken roof and beside a girl who refused to die, there was something else. There was witness. There was truth. And truth, once spoken, has a way of crawling out from the dirt. That night, as crickets sang and coyotes howled in the distance, Mabel drifted into fevered sleep. In her dreams, her mother's voice returned, soft but certain, and somewhere between the memory and the darkness she heard it again, Sheriff Claiborne's voice, whispering like a curse, "You're mine." That morning, the old wood stove creaked as Ronan tossed in a few more splinters of cedar. Outside, the sun crept slow and heavy over the hills, burning away the night's chill, but inside the cabin, the air was thick with silence, an uneasy quiet that hung between two people who both knew too much but had said too little. Mabel sat at the kitchen table, still stiff from her injuries, her hands cradling a chipped ceramic mug filled with coffee she hadn't yet tasted. Her leg rested on a stool beside her, splinted, elevated. Her face was bruised, but the fire in her eyes had returned. Tired, yes, but not extinguished. Ronan moved about with the quiet efficiency of someone used to being alone. He didn't ask her name again. He didn't probe for details. But she could feel the question resting on his shoulders like the dust that coated every shelf. Why her? Why out there? Why left for dead? She broke the silence first. "You said you were a cop once." Ronan nodded without turning. "Long time ago, different town, different badge." "Same lies." "What happened?" He exhaled through his nose. "Tried to do the right thing. Turns out that's not the kind of thing they promote you for." Mabel studied him, the slump of his shoulders, the scar just beneath his collarbone. "And you think the ones who did this to me, they're the same?" Ronan turned then, met her eyes with the weight of experience. "I don't think, I know." She looked down into her mug, then back up. "You ever heard of a woman named Valerie Harper?" He paused, the name hanging in the air like smoke. "Civil rights attorney," she continued. "Worked out of Houston. Took cases nobody else would. Disappeared when I was little." Ronan stared at her, motionless. Then, slowly, he set his coffee down and walked to a drawer near the back of the kitchen. He pulled out an old newspaper clipping, yellowed with time, folded along the creases of pain that hadn't softened with age. "Valerie Harper," he muttered, his voice low and flat. "Yeah, I remember her." He handed her the article. It was brittle, nearly torn. The headline read, "Local attorney demands investigation into sheriff's alleged ties to militia group." Mabel read it slowly, her eyes scanning every sentence like it was part of a puzzle she'd spent her life trying to solve. Ronan pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "She came to my department in '99, he said. "Said she had evidence that Sheriff Charles Claiborne, back when he was just a deputy, was funneling weapons to a militia calling themselves the Sovereign Red Cross, bunch of homegrown extremists who wanted to purify Texas law enforcement." He rubbed a hand down his face. "I believed her, gave her what little intel I could. She said she was going to go public. What happened?" Ronan's jaw clenched. 2 weeks later, her car blew up outside a courthouse in Galveston. No arrests, no charges. The case went cold in less than a month. And Claiborne? Promoted to sheriff the next spring. Mabel sat frozen, the article trembling slightly in her hands. She whispered, "You're telling me the man who tried to kill me, he was part of the same group my mother tried to expose?" Ronan nodded. "It's no coincidence. He didn't just see you as someone to control. You were a threat, a reminder." The breath caught in her chest. All her life Mabel had lived in shadows her mother left behind, quiet warnings, sealed boxes, whispered names she was never allowed to ask about. And now, that shadow had found her in the flesh, pushed her off a cliff, and expected her to vanish, like her mother had. "You're Valerie's daughter?" Ronan said quietly. "Then you were never just a girl to him." Mabel's hands gripped the mug so tightly her knuckles turned white. Everything clicked. The public proposal wasn't just performative. It was possession, dominance. Claiborne wasn't humiliated by rejection. He was enraged by a legacy that refused to be silenced. A girl who wouldn't bend, just like the woman who once dared to speak. Ronan leaned back, eyes narrowing. "You need to leave Texas. Get to someone who can protect you." Mabel shook her head. "No, I need to be heard. Do you have anyone?" She paused, long enough that he didn't ask again. Finally, she whispered, "Maybe." That afternoon, as Ronan mended a fence and Dusty dozed in the shade, Mabel sat at the kitchen table with a pen, a sheet of paper, and the weight of generations on her shoulders. By the time the light spilled through the crooked window panes, casting long streaks of heat across the kitchen floor, Mabel had already been sitting at the warped wooden table for over an hour. Her eyes didn't blink much, and her pen hovered still above a page that trembled ever so slightly beneath her hand. The late morning air carried a silence so deep it pressed on her chest like a weight, a silence interrupted only by the crackle of a dusty old radio sitting in the corner. The reception was faint. The voices came and went through static, like ghosts pulling at reality from the other side of the signal. FBI confirms ongoing search for the missing daughter of the Bureau's director. Mabel froze. Her eyes slowly rose from the blank page, fixing on the radio, as if it might continue the sentence. But the broadcast moved on, just as quickly as it had come. Back to highway closures and a crop report. She closed her eyes. For the first time in days, her breath caught not from fear or pain, but from something much older, much heavier, the haunting ache of being remembered by someone you were told had forgotten you. The world still thought she was gone. Good. But now she knew her voice might still reach someone. She looked down at the page again. The paper was rough, scavenged from a drawer beside the pantry. The lines were faded. But it didn't matter. Her words wouldn't need to be pretty, only true. She began to write. Not like a daughter, not like a victim, but like a survivor who had chosen to bear witness. Her handwriting was careful, her thoughts sharper than ever before. She recounted the pickup, the lies spun by uniformed men with silver pins and sunburned necks. She described the plastic tie that bit into her skin, the hood that smelled of gasoline and fear, the bump of tires on loose gravel, the sound of a cliff edge swallowing breath. She left out names, but not details. She didn't plead. She laid out facts. Facts that would shake anyone trained to read between the lines. And then she did something that made her hand tremble. She signed it, not with her real name, not with anything that could be traced, but with a phrase carved into her memory like the crack in her mother's tombstone. Liberty Rose. It was the code name Valerie Harper had used when she took on the kinds of cases that made enemies out of institutions. A name whispered in court filings and confidential affidavits. A name that had vanished with her mother in the fire and silence of Texas cover-ups. She stared at it. That name, her mother's ghost on paper. And then, with a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding, she folded the letter, slipped it into a weathered envelope she found under the sugar jar, and sealed it with the weight of a daughter's unrelenting memory. She didn't know if it would reach him. She didn't know if he would even recognize her through the distance and the damage. But if there was a man behind the title, and if he was still looking, still hoping, still believing, then she owed it to both of them to send that message into the firestorm that had once consumed her mother and now tried to silence her. As she leaned back, fingers stained with ink, the door creaked open. Ronan stepped inside, his boots coated in the dry dust of the road and his expression twisted by something darker than exhaustion. "I shouldn't have gone," he muttered, tossing his keys onto the counter without looking at her. Mabel said nothing at first. Her eyes still lingered on the envelopes sitting between her palms. Ronan finally looked up. "They're sweeping the town. Folks who used to talk to Valerie, judges, clerks, old defense lawyers, even a guy who just sold her coffee. They're turning up dead or missing, one by one. No public reports, no warrants, just gone." Her blood ran cold, but she didn't flinch. "They're not just after you," he added. "They're burying the past. Every name, every trace." Mabel held up the envelope. "Then we give them something they can't bury." Ronan blinked. She rose, slowly, her bruised legs stiff beneath her. She limped toward the door, handed him the letter. "You said you had a safe way to get something to someone in D.C." He hesitated. "You're sure?" "No," she said, "but I'm alive. That's all I need to be." He stared at the envelope again. "Liberty Rose?" he read aloud, brow furrowed. She looked at him, steady. "That name still scares them." And just like that, the ghosts of Texas were summoned. By sundown, Ronan stood in Lyle's tavern with the smell of whiskey and lies in the air. The old man behind the counter leaned in and whispered, "They're calling it a purge, son. And you're not the only one still on their list. By the time Ronan Blake pushed open the warped oak door of Lyle's tavern, the summer sun had dipped behind the rusted grain silos on the edge of town, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Inside, the bar glowed with that amber haze only places like this could hold, where secrets fermented just as strong as the liquor, and no one said a word unless the jukebox was loud enough to drown out regret. Ronan stepped across the threshold with dust on his boots and something darker clinging to his conscience. The regulars glanced up briefly, old men with leathery skin and stained caps, men with tired eyes and harder voices, but no one welcomed him. They just watched, warily, as if sensing that he carried the scent of something radioactive. At the far end of the bar, behind a shelf of cloudy glass bottles and a calendar still stuck in 1996, stood Lyle. He was well into his 70s now, but age had sharpened him, not softened. His eyes, a faded gray pull, flicked to Ronan's face with the sharpness of someone who'd learned long ago that survival required listening more than speaking. "You're late," Lyle said, not looking up from the glass he wiped for the third time. "Didn't know I was expected," Ronan replied, easing onto the stool nearest the register. Lyle grunted. "In this town, when something breaks, you either show up to fix it, or you're part of the reason it's broken." There was a pause. Long, stiff. The jukebox in the corner played Merle Haggard, his voice raspy with time, the lyrics almost drowned beneath murmured conversations and the clink of whiskey over ice. Then, from the booth nearest the back, where the shadows stretched longest, a name slipped out like a razor, hidden in cotton. Claiborne. Ronan didn't turn his head, but his eyes narrowed. He leaned in just slightly. Lyle kept polishing. "You heard?" "I heard enough," Lyle muttered. "He gave a speech this morning outside the courthouse, all crocodile tears and God bless the dead nonsense, called Mabel an unfortunate soul led astray by the pressures of success." Ronan's jaw clenched. "He said there was no foul play, that the investigation was concluded due to lack of evidence or leads, called it a closed case, cited mental distress." Lyle's voice dipped. Some even clapped. Across the room, a man with a bad-shaped sunburn and tired knuckles lifted his beer and whispered. She was troubled. Didn't know her place. The word place landed like a slap. Ronan heard it before, too many times, from lips that had no idea what it cost someone to exist in a world that had already decided they didn't belong. "They're selling it like gospel," Lyle continued, pouring a finger of rye into a chipped glass, "and most are buying it, even the ones who know better, because they're afraid," Ronan said. "Damn right they are," Lyle snapped, finally looking Ronan dead in the eyes. "Because Claiborne ain't just a badge. He's a business, a goddamn institution, controls the grain routes, owns half the contracts for livestock transport. Hell, he backed 2 of the bank's board members. What folks supposed to do? Starve on principle?" There it was again, that word, supposed, as if morality had an expiration date when your mortgage was 1 month behind and your son needed a second pair of shoes for school. Ronan exhaled slowly. He turned to the back booth where 3 off-duty officers nursed beers under low-hanging lights. They were laughing, but their laughter was hollow, too rehearsed, like the sound of men who had learned that guilt only mattered if it leaked beyond their uniforms. One of them, Officer Clyde Bowers, held up a folded paper, tapped the table, and said in a low chuckle, "Fire list just got longer." Lyle froze. Ronan didn't. He stood, crossed the floor in 5 deliberate steps. The bar, quieted like a switch, had flipped. No more Merle. No more glasses clinking, just the creak of old floorboards and the slow exhale of a man carrying the weight of too many truths. "You keep a list?" Ronan asked, voice low. Bowers smirked, then looked up and immediately stopped smiling. "You're the Blake boy," he said. "Man now." Yeah, man without a badge, without a job, without a wife. He leaned back. Tell me something, Blake. You think all this is your business again? Ronan leaned in so close their foreheads nearly touched. Only when you start writing names on napkins like God, he said. But God never hunted girls to cover his sins. Bower's smile faltered. Ronan's voice dropped even further. You want to run names? Run mine, but leave hers the hell off. He turned and walked out without waiting for a reply. Lyle didn't speak again until Ronan reached the door. Where are you going, Blake? Ronan paused. I'm bringing her back, he said. Not to hide, but to burn down every lie they think can't be touched. And with that, he stepped out into the dusk, the old screen door creaking behind him. That night, beneath the flicker of an oil lamp and the scent of pine smoke curling through cracked window panes, Mabel told Ronan the name she'd been running from all her life, and what it meant when Claiborne tried to erase it. That night the cabin was thick with the scent of pinewood smoke and something heavier, unspoken truth finally pressing against the seams of silence. Outside, the crickets droned in waves, their rhythm steady, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Inside, Mabel sat across from Ronan at the old wooden table. The kerosene lamp between them flickered, as if unsure whether to illuminate or to hide what was about to be said. The air had shifted. She felt it. So did he. He'd seen the fire in her eyes earlier that day when she returned from her letter writing, that flash of something deeper than vengeance, lineage. Now he looked at her the way a soldier might look at a map, moments before realizing the battlefield is his hometown. I never asked, he began quietly, hands resting atop the table, worn and calloused. But I figure now's the time. What's your full name, girl? For a moment, Mabel said nothing. Her fingers grazed the hem of her sleeve, eyes fixed on a knot in the wood beneath the lamp. It wasn't just a name. It was a weapon, a key, a curse. And for 18 years it had been the only thing between her and death. When she finally spoke, it was with the weight of a buried legacy breaking through cracked earth. Mabel Elaine Harper, she said. Her voice didn't shake, but her breath caught the moment after. My father is Douglas Harper. Ronan blinked. He leaned back, slowly, processing. Her gaze didn't falter. The director? He asked. Mabel nodded. Of the FBI. The room held still. Not even the wind outside dared interrupt. Ronan stared, jaw tight, memory gears grinding behind his eyes. Then a whisper of comprehension crossed his face, not shock, not disbelief, but a resigned understanding, the kind only men who've seen systems grind innocence into dust can offer. I knew there was something, he muttered. Your mother, Valerie, and now this. Mabel leaned forward. They told me hiding my name would protect me, that a false ID, a quiet life, and no questions would keep me safe. I believed them, for years. Until now. She reached into the old duffel she'd carried from the edge of the ravine, now patched with duct tape and grit, and pulled out a worn envelope. Inside was the only real photograph of her and her mother ever taken together, and a birth certificate folded a dozen times, edges fraying like the truth itself. After my mother was killed, they buried me in bureaucracy. Relocated. New school, new papers, no birthday parties, no photos online, just shadows and protocols. I wasn't a child, I was a risk assessment. Ronan exhaled, slow and full of something like mourning. Living under another name didn't make me invisible, she said, bitterness creeping in. It made me easier to erase. She stood then, moved to the window. Outside, the moon had risen just enough to cast silver light across the front porch and the tall grass beyond. Her silhouette, framed by the glow, looked more like a figure out of legend than a girl who'd once studied pre-law and wrote poems on gum wrappers. I wasn't just some high school graduate he wanted to own, she whispered. I was the final piece in a war he thought he'd won 20 years ago. Ronan didn't answer right away. He just stared into the lamplight like a man watching a past he thought was dead come clawing back through the walls. "He was afraid of you before you were even born," he finally said. "Afraid of what you'd carry, what you'd remember." Mabel turned, eyes sharp, voice steady. "He tried to bury me because he didn't know I was the daughter of the storm." It wasn't a boast, it wasn't even anger, it was prophecy. Her mother's blood ran in her voice, her father's resilience in her bones. She was no longer a hidden girl or a discarded witness. She was memory made flesh, returning not to beg for justice, but to demand it. Ronan rose slowly from his seat. His face was unreadable, but his hands were no longer trembling. "You ready for what comes next?" he asked. "No," Mabel said, "but I'm not running anymore." She crossed the room and opened the chest near the hearth, pulling out a folded piece of yellow fabric, soft, elegant, worn with time. Her mother's dress, the one she wore the day she marched into a federal courtroom in Austin and called out Claiborne's name for the first time in public. Mabel held it for a long moment, then pressed it to her chest like armor. When she emerged from the bedroom minutes later, dressed in the gold that had once graced justice itself, Ronan didn't say a word. He simply opened the front door. Outside, the night waited like a loaded gun, and Mabel Harper walked into it, not as prey, not as survivor, but as reckoning. Mabel stepped back into the town that had tried to erase her, draped in memory, ready to shatter silence. What waited in the streets of Whitney Memorial was not a welcome party, it was a powder keg. The sun rose slow and sticky over Whitney Memorial, bleeding light across the weathered bricks of Main Street and the creaky awnings of Saturday's farmers' market. It should have been just another sleepy southern morning, mason jars filled with pickled okra, gospel vinyl crackling from an old speaker, gossip wrapped in fried dough and paper bags. But not today. Today something else stirred beneath the surface. A hum, a current, a reckoning dressed in gold. The first to see her was Harold from the bait shop, wiping his hands on a greasy towel and doing a double take so sharp he dropped his thermos. He stood, frozen, mouth ajar, as the figure emerged from the edge of the square, framed by morning light like an apparition or an indictment. Mabel Elaine Harper, not limping, not broken, not hiding behind some new name or a fresh identity like the system had taught her to do since she could walk. No, she came barefoot across the gravel like she owned every rock, every whisper, every secret this town had ever buried. Next to her, Ronan walked with steady steps, hands at his sides but eyes like radar, scanning for movement, betrayal, danger wrapped in denim, and a bat. As they passed the booths, a hush fell, conversations cut off mid-laugh. Children tugged at sleeves, sensing the shift even before they understood it. One man dropped a peach, a woman's lemonade shook in her grip, and from the shade of the corner barber shop, Sheriff Charles Claiborne stepped into the light. His face, once the poster of swagger and control, now twitched like a man seeing his ghost come home for justice. For a long breath, he didn't move, didn't blink, as if by denying her presence he could cancel the reality rising like heat off the pavement. Then she spoke. "I'm not here for an apology," Mabel said, voice cutting through the silence like thunder under a summer sky. "And I sure as hell don't want forgiveness." She walked right past the bakery where he first called her fiancé, in front of everyone, like she was some auction prize, past the gazebo where the school board once praised Claiborne for bridging racial gaps in the community, past the very place her mother once stood, warning the town what Claiborne really was, before she disappeared into sealed files and official silence. And now the daughter stood where the mother had vanished. Claiborne's lips finally moved, curling around something he meant to sound like command, but landed more like fear. "Back up," he murmured to the officers flanking him. "Back inside." Deputy Roy Lasker and Officer Dean Tuck didn't hesitate. They melted into the police station's doorway like shadows ashamed of themselves. A ripple went through the crowd. People leaned in. Whispers crackled like dried leaves underfoot. "That's her, isn't it?" someone breathed. "The Harper girl. No one survives that fall." A white-haired woman near the produce stand clutched her rosary and muttered, "She looks just like Valerie did the day she marched into that courthouse. God help us." Mabel heard every word, and she welcomed it. She turned toward the townspeople, not to ask for belief, but to stare directly into the eyes of every person who'd known something was wrong and said nothing, every teacher who smiled but stayed silent, every neighbor who brought casserole after Valerie's accident but looked away when Claiborne showed up in a new truck paid for by hush money and control. "You thought the cliff was the end?" Mabel called out, lifting her voice above the murmurs. Her eyes locked onto Claiborne's. "No, Sheriff, it was the beginning." He didn't answer. His fists clenched at his sides and his face twitched again, this time not with surprise but calculation. But something in the crowd had already shifted. People were watching differently now. The fear that once protected Claiborne had cracked, and something dangerous was leaking out. Truth. Ronan stepped forward. A single step and the entire town remembered something they'd conveniently forgotten, that he was once one of them, that he'd worn a badge too, that he left when he couldn't stomach the lies anymore. Claiborne saw it too, the threat. The silence stretched until it broke. The wind picked up, fluttering the hem of Mabel's golden dress, the same one her mother wore when she'd tried to expose Claiborne's militia ties in 1999. No one had listened then. They would now. The sheriff took a single step back, unintentional, unconscious, but undeniable. And in that motion the town saw it. He was scared, not of a girl, but of what she remembered. And from here, every secret, every crime, every name and badge and blood-stained truth began to crack open. The storm wasn't coming. It had already arrived, and it wore the face of the girl they'd thrown away. The square had never held its breath so tightly, not during parades, not during fire drills, not even during the flood of '82, when people stood on their rooftops, praying the water would stop rising. But today, Whitney Memorial stood still, not from nature's wrath, but because a truth too large for silence had finally walked back into town on her own 2 feet. Sheriff Charles Claiborne moved through the crowd like a man walking across thin ice. His boots echoed with each step on the asphalt, but it wasn't the sound of authority anymore. It was something thinner, hollow, desperate. Mabel stood tall, arms relaxed by her sides, the golden dress her mother once wore glowing against the summer heat. Beside her, Ronan's quiet presence hummed like a warning bell, one hand resting lightly at his belt, his stance neither offensive nor submissive. But his eyes? They burned holes through the man walking toward them. Claiborne stopped just far enough not to trigger panic, but close enough to command the crowd's attention. The old instincts kicked in, measured breathing, squared shoulders, the smooth, condescending tone he'd perfected over decades of controlling this town with charm laced in steel. "Folks," he began, glancing slowly from one face to another, "I know what you're thinking." Mabel didn't flinch. "You see a girl you thought was lost, tragically, and now she's here, covered in scars, looking for someone to blame." The murmurs began again, cautious and unsure. He raised a hand, silencing them. "I want to make this clear. Mabel Harper has been through a very traumatic episode. After the graduation ceremony, she suffered an emotional breakdown. We arranged for her to receive care, private, discreet, for her own safety. It was smooth, it was calculated, it was the lie of a man who'd told 1,000 just like it and watched them stick." He looked back at her like a father offering mercy, but his eyes betrayed the flicker of fear, just a flash, when he saw she wasn't blinking. "And I'm asking y'all," he said, voice low and dripping with false concern, "let's give her the time she needs to heal. This isn't the place." A sound cut him off. Soft, hollow. A leather satchel dropped onto the pavement between them. Mabel's voice followed. Low, even. "No more lies, Sheriff." She bent down and unfastened the bag. The flap peeled back to reveal a bloodied yellow dress. Ripped, sun-faded, unmistakably the same one she wore in her senior photos. Next to it, a length of worn hemp rope, stained and frayed. And on top, folded with clinical precision, a single index card marked with a red thumbprint and a strip of magnetic tape. It looked insignificant, until she pressed a button on the recorder hidden inside the bag's side pocket, handling static. Then a voice, Claiborne's voice. "You shoulda known your place, girl. Ain't nobody gonna come looking for you out here. You're just another noise in the dirt." The silence that followed was unbearable. One child whimpered. Someone in the back gasped. Mabel didn't look at the crowd. She looked straight at him. "Tell them again, Sheriff," she said, her voice cutting clean through the heat. "Tell them what you said when you thought I was already dead." Claiborne's jaw tensed. A beat passed. 2. Then the calculation returned. "Fabricated," he said, "too quickly. Spliced audio. You can do wonders with a phone app these days. There's no—" "You think I'm that stupid?" Mabel said. "That you can throw me off a cliff, tie me up like livestock, and gaslight an entire town into thinking I snapped?" The crowd was no longer quiet. It was boiling. Not all at once, but one by one, heads began to turn toward each other. Glances were exchanged. Rumors long buried stirred like sediment kicked up by a hard current. The whispers grew louder, not in hysteria, but in clarity, pieces falling into place, old suspicions finding new teeth, and Claiborne saw it. He stepped back. Not far, but enough. Enough to know this wasn't his moment anymore. Ronan leaned slightly toward Mabel, his voice a low murmur. "He's going to run." "I know," she replied, "but not before he burns every file he ever touched." At that, Claiborne turned without a word, shoved through the crowd, and headed back toward the sheriff's station. Doors slammed. Windows closed. Phones were suddenly locked behind password screens. Ronan watched the deputies slip inside like rats sensing a sinking floor. Then came the next move. Barricades. In less than 10 minutes, traffic cones blocked the only 2 roads in or out of Whitney Memorial. Patrol cars parked crosswise. Claiborne's voice, tight with anger now, barked orders over the department's PA system. Town lockdown effective immediately, due to a credible public safety threat. The threat, of course, was truth. Mabel stared down the street as a cruiser backed into position. She saw it clearly, the last line being drawn between justice and control. Ronan adjusted his stance beside her. "You ready for this?" he asked. She didn't hesitate. Born ready. And from here, the storm that had gathered in shadows for 20 years would explode into full daylight. The town had seen her fall. Now it would watch her rise. The air in Ronan's cabin that night felt electric, thick with tension, possibility, and the quiet, unmistakable hum of something irreversible about to unfold. Outside, the pine trees whispered in the wind like an old hymn carrying secrets. Inside, the glow of a single laptop screen carved silhouettes onto the weathered walls, casting long shifting shadows over faces that no longer belonged to people hiding, but to people readying for war. Mabel sat at the edge of the old dining table, hands steady, her gaze locked on the stranger's face lit blue by the computer. Jessie Monroe, barely 26, had a mind that could pull down city firewalls and a tongue sharp enough to slice through court transcripts. A tech savant raised by grandparents in Atlanta, Jessie had learned early on how to translate rage into code. Years ago, she'd helped Ronan's late wife leak internal reports that nearly brought down a sheriff's department in Louisiana, but that attempt ended in tragedy, and Jessie had since gone underground. Now, for the first time in years, she was back in the fight. Everything's in place, Jessie said, typing rapidly, her voice calm but charged. The file is scrubbed clean, metadata erased. The audio is uploaded to 3 mirror sites. When I hit send, it's going to bounce off 1,000 nodes before it even lands. They'll never trace it to this cabin. Ronan stood behind her, arms crossed, eyes watching the screen, but mind pacing elsewhere. Just the audio? Mabel asked. Jessie turned slightly in her seat. No, not just the audio, the story, too. Mabel's brow furrowed. Jessie continued, her fingers never leaving the keyboard. I wrote the caption myself. Something that'll punch through the noise. She paused, then read aloud. Sheriff Charles Claiborne, raised community leader and church deacon, caught on tape threatening the daughter of FBI Director Douglas Harper, moments before she was thrown off a cliff by his men. She survived. Mabel's heart skipped, but she said nothing. Jessie looked up at her, eyes sharp. You sure you're ready to be seen like this? Once it's out, it's not just you anymore. It's who you are, who your father is, who your mother was. They'll dig up everything. I'm not hiding, Mabel said, voice flat, steady. They already tried to erase me once. Jessie nodded, then tapped a final keystroke. The screen flickered. A green status bar slid forward like a slow countdown to impact. By morning, she said softly, the whole country will know. The words hung in the cabin like the final line of a verdict. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Ronan moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to scan the woods. He saw nothing but black trees swaying in silence. Still, something in his posture stayed rigid, like a soldier waiting for the first bomb to drop. Mabel stood and walked over to Jessie, her eyes meeting hers. "Thank you," she said. Jessie shrugged, though the gravity in her eyes betrayed how much it cost her to be here again. They buried my cousin in Louisiana, shot him in the back and called it a warrant error. You're not the first daughter they tried to erase, but you're the first to come back walking. Outside, a night owl screeched in the dark. The cabin creaked as the wind shifted through the gaps in the old wood, and in that quiet, the only thing left was breath. Then Jessie turned the laptop toward Mabel, pulling up the feed. Watch. The post was already spreading. 100 views, then 1,000, 10,000, threads erupting, hashtags forming, Harper daughter, Claiborne cover-up, thrown but not broken. In one video, someone paired the audio with images of Whitney Memorial's town square, splicing Claiborne's threatening voice over the slow zoom of a welcome to our community sign. Jessie smiled coldly. People hate hypocrisy more than crime. You give them a man preaching God while pushing black girls off cliffs, they'll eat him alive. Mabel didn't smile. Her hands were clenched behind her back. It's not justice yet, she said. It's just noise. Jessie tilted her head, thoughtful. Yeah, but sometimes noise is how you bring the rats into the light. From the porch, Ronan's voice called back inside. Phones are dead. Jessie froze. How many? All 3? Ronan replied. And line 2. Jessie pulled out her phone. Cell tower's been ghosted. Mabel's jaw tensed. He's trying to cut the signal. Jessie shook her head. Too late. The data's out. Even if they torch this place, it won't change a thing. Ronan came back in, bolting the door behind him. I don't like this timing, he muttered. He wouldn't kill the tower unless he planned to make a move. Jessie nodded. Then let's be ahead of it. She handed Mabel a burner phone. 1 ping every hour, just enough to say you're still alive. Mabel took it. And if I'm not? Jessie met her eyes. Then the next post is everything else. Names, files, surveillance logs. Ronan locked eyes with Mabel. You're not dying in this cabin, he said. Not on my watch. The screen glowed brighter now. Notifications flooding like a dam had broken. National outlets reposting. Activists tweeting. Even journalists from the city, name Ronan hadn't heard in years, asking for sources, confirmation, interviews. Outside in the distance, the low thrum of engines echoed through the trees. Not close yet, but not far. Mabel turned to the door. She knew what Claiborne would do next. Desperation made monsters of men already steeped in evil. And now, cornered, wounded and exposed, he would burn everything that could tie him to what he did. But what he didn't understand, what he could never comprehend, was that this time, the fire wouldn't destroy the evidence. It would illuminate it, and before dawn, a storm would descend on Whitney Memorial that not even God himself could quiet. They came just after sunrise, vans and satellite trucks, with spinning dishes and decals from every network coast to coast, CNN, NBC, Fox News, even a scrappy independent live streamer from Oakland wearing a GoPro strapped to his chest. They came like storm chasers, hunting a fire too big to miss. And Whitney Memorial, the town that had long lived quietly off the grid, found itself, overnight, the eye of a media cyclone. The gravel at the main checkpoint crunched beneath tires as the first wave approached, but just past the town's welcome sign, now half splintered from age and riddled with bullet pocks, 2 police SUVs blocked the road, lights flashing but sirens quiet. It wasn't a show of urgency, it was a warning. Sheriff Claiborne's hastily assembled officers, armed and stone-faced, stood shoulder to shoulder behind orange barricades labeled in bold stencils, "Emergency Lockdown. No press permitted beyond this point." The reporters stepped out of their vans anyway. Leanna Reed, veteran field correspondent for NBC News, stood among them, tall, black, and unflinching. Her press badge gleamed against her navy flak jacket, but it was her eyes that did most of the talking. She had seen the streets of Baltimore burn and had stood beneath Confederate statues when they fell. But here, in this sleepy stretch of Texas soil, the danger was quieter, meaner, because it came wrapped in protocol and sealed with a sheriff's smirk. She stepped forward and raised her mic. The camera went live. This is Leanna Reed reporting from Whitney Memorial, Texas, where an alleged cover-up involving the sheriff's department, a missing black teenager, and a leaked confession tape has drawn national outrage. But instead of cooperation, journalists are being met with martial control. Behind her, a wide-angle camera panned slowly across the scene. Barricades, officers gripping rifles, press credentials denied. One man in tactical gear was overheard saying, "Orders came straight from the sheriff's mouth, no exceptions." Leanna didn't flinch. The cameraman zoomed in as she stood beneath the freshly installed digital sign, its red LED letters flashing over and over. Emergency lockdown. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, silenced by a sharp command. The morning air was still, heavy with anticipation. "If you ever wondered what silence looks like," she said, her voice measured, cutting through the static, "it looks like a white town scared of a black girl's truth." Inside one of the news vans, feeds from social media exploded. Viewers from Seattle to Savannah tuned in, texting, tweeting, demanding access. The public wasn't just watching, they were boiling. Back in the cabin, Ronan adjusted the antenna, squinting at the flickering image of Leanna on the screen. Mabel sat at the table, watching in silence, one hand curled tightly around the mug of coffee she'd barely touched. Her face was unreadable, but her pulse thrummed like a war drum beneath her skin. "You see that?" Ronan said quietly. "You cracked the silence." Mabel didn't speak. She stood, walked to the window and looked toward the south, toward the horizon where the dust was rising in long mechanical spirals. Something was coming. Moments later, the thrum of a rotor pierced the stillness, low and steady at first, then louder, closer. A helicopter crested the southern ridge, sleek, black, and unmistakably federal. It carried no network logo, no local insignia, just a subdued U.S. government seal and a sharp, angular nose that cut through the sky like a blade. Ronan stepped out onto the porch, shielding his eyes with a weathered hand. "That's not state," he murmured. "That's federal." The chopper circled wide above the town entrance, slow and deliberate, as if reading the mood from the air. Below, the barricade stiffened. The local deputies exchanged uncertain glances. The press held their ground, cameras rolling, phones out, narrating history in real time. Then, as if on cue, a voice crackled through loudspeakers mounted on the helicopter's belly. "This is the FBI. Step back from all municipal blockades. Do not interfere with press access. This is an active civil inquiry, protected under federal law." The statement fell like a thunderclap. At the barricade, Sheriff Claiborne's men faltered. One deputy lowered his rifle slightly. Another took a half step back. But none moved to open the road. Not yet. Inside the control room of the main precinct, Sheriff Claiborne watched the helicopter feed from a secure monitor, his face expressionless, save for a twitch in his jaw. He knew what that seal meant. He knew what came next. He turned to his captain. "Seal the back roads. Tell them it's for safety. Stall them until I say otherwise. But Sheriff, do it. Now." Back outside, Leanna Reed took a long breath and stepped closer to the barricade. "To our viewers just joining us," she said into the camera, "federal aircraft have just intervened in the lockdown of Whitney Memorial. The question now is, what is Sheriff Claiborne hiding that warrants a block on national media? And what does the FBI already know?" Her words echoed across a country still half asleep in pajamas and morning coffee, now staring, transfixed, at their screens. They watched a small town unravel in real time. They watched silence crack, and somewhere in the growing crowd behind the barricade, unnoticed, unarmed and unafraid, Mabel stepped forward. No uniform, no title, just her name, her blood, and the truth that refused to stay buried. The helicopter descended not like a savior, but like a reckoning. Its rotors carved through the southern air with a mechanical finality, drawing every eye from the press lines, from the townsfolk peering behind curtains, from deputies growing increasingly unsure of where their loyalty might now lead them. Dust swirled in slow, deliberate spirals across the landing field just outside Whitney Memorial. A field that hadn't seen this kind of federal presence since the Cold War drills of 1961. But what landed here now wasn't military. It was justice arriving in full. The side door of the chopper swung open with a metallic groan. Out stepped Douglas Harper. He was not the man local gossip had tried to imagine over the past week. He didn't arrive in rage. He arrived in silence. A tall, imposing figure wrapped in the kind of charcoal gray suit that carried the weight of institutions. His steps were even. His shoulders didn't slump, but something in his face was carved from a stone older than grief. A deep, familiar knowing of systems that chew through people and spit out excuses. He paused at the edge of the field, removed his sunglasses with a slow, methodical motion, and scanned the town from behind tired eyes. Then his gaze settled, not on the reporters or the federal agents stepping down beside him, but on her. Mabel stood alone at the edge of the gravel. Her yellow dress whipped in the rotor wash, eyes locked on the man she hadn't seen in 5 years. For a single second, the world held its breath. She didn't run to him. She screamed. "Where were you?" The shout split through the wind like a broken bottle, not rehearsed, not softened. It came from a place far deeper than abandonment. From years of not knowing if she was being forgotten or protected, erased or avenged. Harper didn't flinch. He simply looked at her, his daughter, no longer a girl hidden in safe houses and aliases, no longer the silent footnote in a long-buried scandal, and answered quietly, "Exactly where I needed to be to find you." The words didn't heal. They didn't even comfort, but they cut through the noise like a bridge. Fragile, unresolved, but finally real. He took a step forward. "You weren't lost," he said. "You were hidden. And suddenly, the image that had dominated Mabel's nightmares for years, her father standing behind desks under seals too far away to reach, cracked. For the first time, she saw not just a federal director, she saw the man who had carried her mother's blood on his hands, the man who had sent her into exile for protection, the man who now stood in the dirt she nearly died beneath. Behind him, a team of agents moved in formation. Dark suits, encrypted tablets, forensic crates slung over shoulders. They didn't speak to the press. They didn't wave to the crowd. These were not peacekeepers. They were recorders of rot, seekers of evidence, and they were here with one mission: to freeze every lie that had been allowed to fester inside the town's badge-lined walls. Director Harper turned to the lead agent beside him, voice sharp and unyielding. "Preserve every record. I want every terminal inside that sheriff's department sealed. If one byte goes missing, I'll hold the entire department in contempt." The order sent a shiver through the officers still guarding the barricades, and from a distance, Sheriff Claiborne, watching through the slats of his office blinds, felt it too. His hands clenched on the windowsill, the sweat under his collar now a noose tightening by the second. Mabel took a shaky breath. Her anger hadn't faded, but it had shifted, now anchored by something larger than pain. She walked toward her father not as a child returning home, but as a survivor returning to the war. The press surged toward the scene, shouting questions, capturing every frame. The narrative had changed. This was no longer about a local girl gone missing. This was the daughter of the FBI director, presumed dead, walking into the arms of a father whose silence had raised 1,000 suspicions, and whose presence now confirmed the depth of the conspiracy. Leanna Reed pushed past the crowd and raised her mic toward Harper. "Director Harper, can you confirm if the leaked audio recording is authentic? Was your daughter the target of an assassination attempt?" He didn't pause. "I'll answer those questions once the evidence is secured. For now, my only comment is this. Whitney Memorial is not a town under investigation. It's a crime scene." Gasps rippled across the field. One reporter muttered, "Oh, it's over for Claiborne." But Harper wasn't done. He turned back to the chopper, then motioned toward the digital sign still flashing emergency lockdown at the edge of town. "That lockdown," he said, voice rising so even the locals tucked behind storefronts could hear, "is lifted, effective immediately. Any officer who continues to enforce it without federal order will be removed from post." The deputies at the roadblock hesitated. Then slowly, one by one, they stepped back. The barricades were pulled away. The first camera crews began to roll forward, eyes wide, equipment buzzing. The town was open again. But now, everyone would see what lay beneath. As Harper and Mabel stood side by side for the first time in public, a whisper passed through the onlookers, a murmur of recognition not just of who she was, but what she represented. Not just a girl who had survived a fall, but a woman who had risen to reveal the fall of something far greater. "Preserve all records. I want every server in that precinct sealed, now." Director Douglas Harper's order reverberated through Whitney Memorial like a thunderclap, splitting the seams of silence. The FBI swept into the police department not with theatrical aggression, but with a cold, surgical focus, honed from decades of exposing systems that rot behind patriotic slogans and rusted steel doors. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed above nervous deputies who had never imagined they'd be the ones standing on the receiving end of federal protocol. Gray-suited agents moved like phantoms through the halls, tagging desktops, photographing hard drives, collecting body cams, memos, lockers, everything. Each step was documented. Every drawer opened without permission was photographed, logged, and sealed. The forensics team didn't ask permission. They operated from authority the locals had long forgotten could still be enforced. Sheriff Claiborne sat behind his desk, a trembling vein bulging along his temple. trying to keep his tone civil while speaking to a stoic, clipboard-wielding agent named Carla Brooks. She was young, black, and clearly unimpressed by titles. "I'll need a chain of custody receipt if you're touching our archived logs," Claiborne said, voice tight, almost rehearsed. Agent Brooks didn't look up. "We're not touching your logs. We're recovering what you tried to delete." The words sliced deeper than any insult, and Claiborne knew then this wasn't a PR stunt or some brief media circus to weather. This was a sweep, a full smackle federal cleansing, and it wasn't going away in a week. Meanwhile, just down the hall, two IT stations sat strangely unmanned. The cubicles, once belonging to Charles Newton and Darren McGill, held nothing but empty coffee mugs and cold, black monitors. A quick systems check confirmed the worst. Both men had gone missing sometime in the last 12 hours. Their homes were abandoned, phones offline, their families unreachable. In their place, two partially wiped external drives still humming from incomplete erasure commands. "Attempted deletion?" murmured one of the forensic techs. "But clumsy, almost like they panicked." But the real discovery was still buried, hidden beneath a floor panel behind the archives room. Ronan Blake, acting entirely on instinct and memory, had slipped into the building under the guise of assisting the federal team. He knew this station. He'd been a deputy here long before Claiborne seized control. And he knew something else. Corruption never hides behind locked doors. It hides in plain sight. Inside overlooked corners no one bothers to question. In the far back of the station, behind a steel cabinet that hadn't been moved in years, Ronan found it. A shallow vent, half loosened, concealed behind dust-thick blinds and a stack of forgotten uniforms. He pried it open. Inside, one file. Paper, not digital, bound in twine. The label, handwritten in ink that had begun to fade, read, "Clean Sheet Project, internal use only." Ronan opened it carefully. Page after page. Names. Black men. Black women. Some marked with red X's, others circled. Dates of disappearance. Police reports never filed. Witnesses labeled inconclusive. Every name connected to a small incident. A traffic stop, a noise complaint, a jaywalking ticket, and then nothing. Ghosts. Ronan's hands trembled. He turned the last page. There it was. Valerie Harper. Her name wasn't just on the list. It was highlighted. Next to it, typed in red, confirmed elimination. Silence, priority. He stared at the page. A woman whose voice had rattled courthouses and sparked lawsuits, reduced to a code on a hidden document that was never meant to be found. And now, her daughter had almost shared her fate. "This wasn't about me," Mabel had told him the night before, as she packed up the remnants of her mother's letters. It was about everyone they tried to erase. And now Ronan had proof. He exited the storage room as calmly as he could, slipping the file beneath his jacket, heart pounding against the weight of guilt and memory. He walked past Claiborne's office. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. Claiborne knew, and now Ronan knew that he knew. Outside, the media frenzy was growing. Satellite trucks lined the streets like modern siege weapons aimed at the town's denial. Live feeds streamed from parking lots. Every headline flashed the same phrase in red banners. "Doctor of FBI Director Survivors Murder Attempt. Local police involved." But inside the police department, the real war was being waged with evidence, one box at a time. Ronan returned to the cabin after nightfall. Mabel was waiting, standing beneath the flickering porch light like a sentinel of grief, wrapped in steel. He handed her the file, wordlessly. She opened it slowly, eyes scanning each name as if mourning every person individually. Then she reached the final page. She didn't cry. She didn't curse. She whispered, "They made a list." And Ronan answered, "Now the world will read it." One of the last names on the clean sheet list was Valerie Harper. It wasn't a discovery, it was a confirmation. Like someone finally drawing blood where there was always pain. That night, Mabel didn't sleep. She didn't speak. She sat at the edge of Ronan's cabin porch, file in her lap, her mother's name carved in ink like an old scar reopened. The next morning, Director Douglas Harper stood beside her in the FBI's mobile command unit, his posture rigid, his breath shallow, as if bracing for a truth he never wanted to face out loud. He looked older under fluorescent lights, not because of time, but because of history. They stood across from Special Agent Tara Kim, a woman with a voice that cut through silence like glass under pressure. Tara, petite in stature but enormous in presence, was known within federal circles as the one who unearthed rot within the rut, internal corruption no one dared name, especially when it wore a badge. She laid down a single folder across the table. It was sealed, stamped in faded red. Mabel didn't move at first. "What is that?" she finally asked, her voice hoarse, eyes fixed on the folder like it might ignite if she touched it. Tara's answer came low and deliberate. "It's the original federal request to investigate your mother's murder, filed in March of 1999. Never approved, never logged into the national database, never even opened past preliminary clearance." Douglas stepped forward, jaw tight. "I didn't know this file existed." Tara met his eyes. "You weren't supposed to." She turned back to Mabel. "That file was buried under internal override, flagged counter risk to community stability, which in plain English means someone with local authority convinced a federal liaison that pressing the case would lead to civil unrest." Mabel slowly peeled back the cover. The pages inside weren't as dusty as she expected. They were clean, too clean. Freshly printed copies of old testimony, time-stamped logs, and a clipped court submission from the original trial. But one page stopped her cold. A signed affidavit, witness to a domestic dispute the day Valerie Harper was ambushed and shot outside a small civil rights meeting in Birmingham. The statement claimed she had been arguing with an unidentified black male before she was caught in crossfire. Witness Deputy Claiborne. Mabel's hand shook, her breath caught in her throat. Tara didn't wait for the question. "That affidavit was the sole reason the DOJ shelved your mother's case. The implication that she was involved in personal conflict removed her from protection as a civil target. It rewrote her death into an unfortunate personal event." "He didn't just kill my mother's case," Mabel whispered. "He killed her voice." Douglas leaned on the table now, eyes closed, fighting a tide of regret too vast for words. For all the clearance he held, for all the years he spent crawling through Washington's political trenches, somehow he had never found this file. Or maybe he was never supposed to. Mabel flipped another page. Claiborne's badge number appeared again, this time beside an internal FBI memo, "Recommend discontinuation of Harper investigation. Source indicates potential black extremist affiliations. Request withdrawal of local attention." Her mouth went dry. It was the same tactic. Again and again. Weaponize innuendo. Justify silence. Erase. She slammed the folder shut, the sound echoing in the sterile mobile trailer like a gunshot in church. "I want to go on record," she said, looking directly at Tara Kim. "You already are," Tara replied, gesturing to the recording device blinking red on the desk. "Everything you've said since opening that file is admissible." But Mabel wasn't done. Her fists clenched. "No, I mean national, public, a broadcast. Not behind closed doors, not buried in transcripts. I want every single American who's ever been told to shut up and stay small to hear what he did to my mother. I want them to know her name, and I want them to know mine." Tara glanced at Director Harper. He gave a slow nod. Not as a father, but as a federal official surrendering to the gravity of justice long denied. Mabel stood. Her voice didn't shake. "Schedule it. I'll speak tonight." She turned toward the door, gripping the widow file like a sword made of paper and memory. As she stepped into the sun outside, the wind lifted the corner of the folder, exposing one last page clipped to the back, a note, typed, unsigned. If Harper's daughter ever resurfaces, contain quietly. Risk matrix unacceptable. Use local containment authority. Her jaw tightened. This wasn't coincidence. It was orchestration. Claiborne hadn't just tried to kill a witness. He had tried to complete a legacy. But he failed. Mabel stepped down the trailer steps with fire in her blood and centuries at her back. She was no longer asking for justice. She was demanding it. The stage wasn't a marble podium or federal court chamber. It was the cracked stone steps of the old Memorial Chapel, the only building in Whitney untouched by police funding or militia history, though stained by silence. Once a place where black families weren't allowed to wed. Today it stood as the ground from which Mabel Harper would speak, not for herself, but for the dead, the disappeared, and the deliberately forgotten. The churchyard overflowed. Townsfolk in denim and dust-stained work shirts stood shoulder to shoulder with reporters in tailored jackets, each gripping microphones like weapons against denial. Cameramen perched on truck hoods, children clutched the hems of their mothers' coats, and above them all, the late summer sun glared down as if holding its breath. Mabel stepped up onto the platform, dressed in black slacks and her mother's yellow blazer, a faded relic from courtroom days long gone, the collar frayed but proud. Leanna Reed from MSNBC stood nearby, watching with a nod, her camera crew already counting down. A silence swept the crowd that no siren could drown. Then Mabel spoke. Her voice didn't tremble. It split the air like thunder, wrapped in silk. "My name is Mabel Elaine Harper," she said. "Some of you knew me as the girl who worked part-time at Miss Corey's diner, or as the one always walking home with a book in her arms. Some of you didn't know me at all, because you never cared to look." She paused, scanning faces, familiar and newly terrified. "I was thrown off a cliff by the man sworn to protect this town. I was buried alive. I survived." Gasps fluttered. The church bells didn't ring. They held their silence. He thought no one would find me, and he was almost right. Behind her, screens lit up with images, not courtroom sketches, but evidence. Photos of the rope, the bloodied dress, the burned hillside, and the list. The clean sheet. Faces appeared beside names. Brown faces. Black faces. Names whispered behind closed doors, now displayed before the nation. "I want to talk about Sheriff Claiborne," she said, the name landing like an indictment in itself. "He didn't just try to kill me. He didn't just silence a witness. He is, and has always been, a ranking member of an extremist group called the Sovereign Red Cross, a militia network that trains in seclusion, recruits from local law enforcement, and erases opposition under the guise of order." People gasped. Some shouted lies, while others wept without sound. She held up the widow file. "This man falsified a witness statement to derail a federal case into the murder of a civil rights lawyer. That lawyer was my mother." A few townsfolk shifted uncomfortably, their memories pricked awake. She fought for the families whose homes were seized, whose sons were beaten, whose daughters were shamed. She died on Alabama asphalt with my name in her mouth. And for 20 years, this town celebrated Claiborne as a war hero, while he orchestrated a campaign of fear beneath your noses. She let the silence breathe, not to dramatize, but to punish. "If you're white and you're uncomfortable right now," Mabel continued, stepping closer to the nearest camera lens, "remember, I'm standing here alive. That's what scares you most." Her voice cracked but never wavered. "Because if I'm here, that means your silence isn't working anymore. That means the stories you told yourselves about order, about loyalty, about tradition, they're broken." Gasps turned to murmurs, but no one left. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the list, the clean sheet, waving it once, This is a record of black people declared missing with no further inquiry. They were parents, children, veterans, nurses, all vanished in this district over the last decade, all signed off by Sheriff Claiborne's department. Behind her, on the temporary screens, faces from that list appeared again, this time with dates, places last seen. One bore the name Valerie Harper. She stared directly into the lens again. You didn't lose track of us. You erased us. Leona Reed's live feed cut to a close-up. The internet surged. Hashtags exploded. Harper broadcast trended across platforms within minutes. CNN delayed a commercial break. Fox News went split-screen. Even small-town radio dialed in. But Mabel hadn't finished. This is not just about a sheriff. This is not just about one town. This is about a system that only believes black pain when it bleeds on camera. About a country that doesn't flinch when we scream, only when we survive. The crowd was dead quiet, and the only thing more dangerous than a black girl who speaks, Mabel said, now lowering her voice, is one they tried to silence and failed. A few clapped, then more. Then a surge of applause swept through the crowd like a tidal release of something long held in the chest of this town. But before the moment could settle, bang! A single shot cracked through the parking lot, silencing everything. Screams tore across the courtyard. Reporters ducked. Parents grabbed children. Mabel didn't move. She stood still, eyes widening, hand tightening around the microphone. Agents swarmed toward her. Leona shouted into her headset. Officers unholstered their weapons. Ronan, standing at the edge of the steps, scanned the crowd and lunged toward Mabel. But there was no second shot. Just silence. Then sirens. The echo of the gunshot hadn't yet died before chaos erupted, like a sudden storm tearing through a quiet sky. Screams fractured the solemn stillness that had held the chapel grounds in reverence only seconds before. People scattered, parents yanking children behind parked cars, reporters diving behind camera rigs, and agents shouting over one another into radios that crackled with interference and dread. From the parking lot, the smoke of gunpowder hung in the hot August air, catching the sun like a veil of malice. And through that smoke, moving with calculated violence, came the shooter, a man in civilian clothing, pale-faced, nondescript, forgettable if not for the cold, mechanical way he raised his weapon again. There was no hesitation, no warning. His hand didn't tremble. Mabel didn't flinch. She stood frozen on the church steps, the microphone slipping from her hand, her eyes fixed on the muzzle now aiming for her chest. In that split second between breath and bullet, time bent. Then a body hurled into her. It was Ronan. The crack of the second shot punched through the air, sharper than the first. Ronan's body jerked as the round caught his shoulder, but he didn't cry out. His momentum knocked Mabel off her feet, both of them tumbling hard to the ground behind the stone railing. Blood bloomed through the back of his shirt like a spreading shadow. Federal agents surged forward, weapons drawn, shouting commands. FBI, drop it! Now! But the shooter wasn't looking to be arrested. He ducked behind a gray SUV, firing 2 more rounds before vanishing into the line of cars that rimmed the lot. Sirens wailed in triplicate. Drones above began to whirl into position. Officers encircled the scene, some attending to civilians, others sprinting after the attacker, who had already slipped through the maze of license plates and tailgates. Claiborne wasn't among the agents. In fact, Claiborne wasn't anywhere to be seen. Inside the chapel vestibule, a federal tech tapped furiously at a tablet. "Sir," she shouted into her headset, "Sheriff Claiborne's vehicle just exited via Route 47 West. No escort, no authorization. He's fleeing." From a hill overlooking the chapel, a silver Chevy Suburban peeled away from a grove of trees, the windows blacked out, license plate removed. The driver, Claiborne, gripped the wheel with bloodless knuckles. There was no radio, no phone in his ear. Just him, a full tank of gas, and the weight of 2 decades of secrets hissing in the rearview mirror. Back at the church, Mabel was helping Ronan to sit up, her hands trembling against the wound at his shoulder. His face was pale, jaw clenched. "You idiot," she whispered, tears brimming. "You should have let me take the damn bullet." He managed a weak smile. "I was married to a civil rights lawyer, remember? I don't let strong black women go down alone." She laughed through a sob. It sounded like pain trying to sound like strength. FBI medics rushed in, pulling Ronan onto a stretcher, applying pressure as they wheeled him toward the mobile unit. But Mabel didn't follow. Her eyes were no longer on Ronan. They were searching the horizon, scanning for the man who had started it all, the man who had buried her alive, erased her mother, and now left a trail of bodies in his escape. An agent approached, blood still fresh on his gloves. "We've locked the perimeter. But the shooter was a plant, likely embedded for weeks. He's sovereign, no ID, no social footprint. Someone, backed by money and silence." Mabel's voice was low but steady. "They didn't come for justice. They came to finish the job." The agent nodded grimly. "And now they've failed again." But Mabel didn't share the confidence. The patterns were too precise, the timing too rehearsed. Claiborne didn't panic. He didn't protest. He vanished the second the plan hit resistance. This wasn't the flailing of a guilty man. It was the precision of someone who knew exactly when the walls would collapse and where the cracks had already been laid. Inside the media tent, Leanna Reed resumed her broadcast with shaking hands. "We're reporting live from Whitney Memorial, where just moments ago a gunman opened fire during the public address of Mabel Harper, the woman at the center of a national reckoning. At least one injured, the assailant still at large. Local Sheriff Claiborne is also missing. The FBI has now officially declared him a suspect in multiple federal investigations, including obstruction of justice and attempted murder." Across the country, living rooms erupted in disbelief. Elderly viewers leaned in closer, tears clouding cataracts, fists curling in indignation. Veterans of civil rights marches whispered the names of those they'd buried too soon. Parents called their children. Grandmothers clutched rosaries. And somewhere in Arkansas, an old black man named Robert, who had marched with King and buried 2 brothers during Reconstruction's second death in the 60s, leaned back in his recliner and said aloud, "They thought they buried a girl. They didn't know she was a damn earthquake." By dusk, Whitney Memorial was under federal lockdown. Roadblocks stretched 5 miles in each direction. Helicopters combed the backwoods. Claiborne's picture flashed across every channel in America. But Mabel didn't rest. While Ronan underwent surgery, she met with Harper and the agents still sorting evidence from the clean sheet files. Each name on that list, each family erased, was now another brick in the case being built. Still, the town buzzed with unease. Because everyone knew something Mabel didn't say on camera. Claiborne had been preparing his exit for years. The sky over Texas bled amber as the sun dragged itself down behind a stretch of highway long forgotten by time, flanked by brittle grasslands, and the skeletal remains of towns too poor to rebuild, too stubborn to die. Claiborne's Suburban raced down that strip of cracked asphalt like a ghost fleeing daylight, tires eating miles with the desperation of a man running from something older than law. Consequence. Inside the cabin, his fingers were taut on the steering wheel, knuckles the color of ash. A sheen of sweat clung to his forehead despite the air conditioning blasting full tilt. His eyes flicked constantly to the rearview mirror, though no lights trailed him, not yet. Claiborne wasn't the kind of man to believe in panic. He believed in preemption. And so, while the nation gasped at headlines bearing his name in bold, FBI wanted, Sheriff Claiborne vanishes after church shooting, he remained calm, calculating. Focused, he pulled off the main highway near mile marker 214, passing through a rusted chain-link gate hidden by rows of overgrown mesquite trees. Beyond it stretched a narrow gravel path, winding deeper into nothing. No signs, no signals. Just a clearing 2 miles in, shielded by towering oaks and silence. The facility didn't look like much, just a series of metal sheds, a water tower, and a longhouse with boarded windows. But underground, beneath layers of concrete and reinforced steel, lay the nerve center of Sovereign Red Cross's regional operation. A place built not just for hiding, but for surviving. Claiborne pulled in, killed the engine, and stepped out without a word. 3 men emerged from the shadows to meet him, 2 armed, 1 not. The unarmed man wore a tan field jacket and carried himself like someone who had seen the inside of too many war zones and trusted no one who hadn't bled. "Clay," he said flatly, "you weren't supposed to come back." Claiborne looked the man square in the eye. "I didn't come back. I came to finish." The man, known only as Rook, motioned for the others to stand down. "Then you better have a damn good reason." They walked into the longhouse, ducking beneath low wooden beams, the floorboards creaking like bones protesting resurrection. Once inside, Claiborne set his bag down and pulled out a small black flip phone, one that didn't ping towers, didn't store contacts, didn't even ring. It buzzed once. He entered a secure code, then spoke into the void. "Need the burn protocol, Vault A, Server Delta. Full sweep." A pause. A voice on the other end responded, low and rasping. "Clearance." Claiborne gave a number. The voice went silent. Then, "Confirmed. If we fall loud. Burn everything." Claiborne hung up. He turned to Rook. "Within the hour, this place has to be gone. Documents, drives, cache logs, war maps, ashes." Rook raised an eyebrow. "That bad?" Claiborne nodded once. The girl lived. And the feds know. That was all it took. The command spread like a virus through the facility. Men and women in tactical gear began emptying crates, shredding files, soaking papers in accelerant. Hard drives were smashed. Cards dissolved in acid baths. Everything they had built for a decade, every name, every bank trail, every senator on the payroll, was about to disappear in smoke. But in his rush to escape, Claiborne had missed something. Back in Whitney Memorial, in the comms lab set up by federal agents, a signal began blinking on one of the screens. Not a phone, not a car. A soft pulse pinging every 12 seconds is bedded in an object not meant to carry one. Douglas Harper stood over the technician's shoulder, his eyes narrowing. "Where's that coming from?" he asked. The agent keyed in a cross-recommend. "A duffel bag, sir," she replied. "One that left the church yesterday. Presumed stolen. Belonged to Mabel Harper." The screen zoomed in, triangulating the source, and then it appeared. The dusty plains of East Texas. A rural junction. Coordinates too specific to be chance. Harper turned toward Tara Kim. "Get me eyes on that grid. Aerial. Ground. Infrared. Now." In the burned heart of the Texas brush, Claiborne lit a cigarette with shaking hands and watched as a server tower was doused with gasoline. Something about the way the smoke curled in the dying sun reminded him of a time before power, when he still believed the badge meant more than leverage. But that world was gone, and so was he, nearly. Except for the device, no bigger than a thumb, stitched into the lining of Mabel's old tennis bag. The very one Claiborne had scooped up by accident in his flight from the chapel. The very one now blinking its signal like a heartbeat to the sky. 30,000 feet above, a surveillance drone adjusted its angle. "Target confirmed," the operator said into his mic. "We have Claiborne. Repeat, fugitive in open terrain, no cover. Authorization to proceed?" Harper didn't hesitate. "Send the net." Back at the compound, as Claiborne stepped outside for air, a shadow passed overhead. He looked up, just for a second, long enough to see the shape slicing across the sunset. Black, circular, quiet. He froze. Then the blast came, not from above, but from the north tree line. Flashbangs first, then boots, federal, armed, and behind them, walking through the smoke like prophecy fulfilled, was Mabel Harper. No longer hidden, no longer hunted, but Claiborne hadn't seen her yet, because for the first time in his life, the man who buried truth for a living was about to meet it face to face. Night crept through the branches of Pine Bluff like a secret too ashamed to speak. Wind whispered through the tall pines, rustling with a breathless tension that made even the insects go still. In the heart of this black forest stood a forgotten cabin, its shutters crooked, roof sagging, the smell of mildew thick in the air. Inside, lit only by the blue flicker of a burner phone, sat the man who once ruled an entire town with nothing but a badge and a sneer, Sheriff Claiborne. He hadn't slept, not really, not since the church, not since the gunshots, not since that girl, that black girl, stood on holy ground and told the whole damn country what he was, and now they were here for him. He heard them hours before they announced themselves. Distant rustles, too methodical to be animals, quiet taps of suppressed boots combing the perimeter. They thought the trees would keep them hidden, but Claiborne had hunted men before. He knew how wolves moved in the dark. He had a shotgun, a sidearm, and a plan. But he also had something else, a choice. The first flashlight beam hit the cabin door like a silent alarm. Red laser dots skittered across the window panes. Through the cracked slats, he caught glimpses of flak jackets with FBI stenciled across the chest. Then the voice came, clear, steady, amplified from a megaphone somewhere near the porch. Sheriff Charles Claiborne, this is Special Agent Talia Kim of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are surrounded. We advise immediate surrender. Claiborne didn't flinch. He rose slowly, stretched his back, and poured the last of his whiskey into a cracked mug. Then he did something strange. He laughed, because of course they sent her. Kim, Korean-American, female, federal. He could feel the irony chewing at him. But before he could speak, the phone on the table buzzed. He looked down, scowled. Video call. Unknown number. He hesitated only a second before answering. The screen lit up, not with a badge or an agent or a judge, but her, Mabel, standing in what looked like a dimly lit federal van, flanked by agents, hair tied back, expression carved from stone. You don't get to vanish into some backwoods like a legend, she said. Not after what you did, not after what you built. Claiborne leaned closer, lit cigarette in hand. Built? Girl, I preserved. I was the last thread keeping that town from unraveling. You think what I did was evil? You think history's clean? Mabel didn't blink. I think men like you hide behind history to justify cruelty. He chuckled, low and bitter. You think you've won just 'cause you survived? I didn't win, she said, voice tightening, but I'm still standing, and you're surrounded. So here's your choice. He leaned in, exhaling smoke. Oh, let me guess. Lay down arms, walk out quiet, pretend the system's just. She didn't smile. No. You can die a soldier, or confess, like a coward. Claiborne's grin twisted into something unreadable. Confess? He rose, turned the phone to show the cracked walls of the cabin, the spiderwebs along the ceiling. I was the law for 20 years, and now I'm the damn testimony. He crushed the cigarette beneath his heel and walked slowly to the door. Outside, the lasers steadied on his chest. Red dots, white breath, black silence. Agent Tara Kim stepped forward. On your knees, hands behind your head. But Claiborne didn't drop. Not yet. I'll come in, he said loudly, voice echoing between the trees. But I talk. Not to your lawyers, not to your press. He held up the phone, still connected to Mabel. To her. And I want cameras. I want Congress. I want a hearing where every secret this country tried to bury gets unearthed. You want my surrender? Then I'm dragging the whole damn system down with me. A pause, then a single nod from Mabel. Back inside the federal van, Agent Harper turned to his team. "Accept the terms," he said coldly. "But he doesn't lead the story." "She does." A chorus of silent agreement passed between the agents. Outside the cabin, Claiborne slowly lowered to one knee. The sound of rustling leaves was drowned out by the click of handcuffs locking into place, but Mabel's voice still rang in his ears. "You weren't the law. You were its mask." As they led him through the woods, floodlights cut through the darkness, drones circled overhead, helicopters hovered at the edges of silence. Reporters lined the roads miles away. America was watching. And for the first time, it wasn't a black girl on trial, it was the man who buried her. The wind in Houston carried a different kind of weight that autumn, less the heat of summer, more the hushed breath of a country watching itself in the mirror. Outside the federal courthouse, the crowd pulsed like a held breath, held in place not by barriers or marshals, but by something older, heavier, the long shadow of silence finally breaking. News vans lined the blocks like battle flags. Protest signs waved over the shoulders of grieving mothers, veterans of other courtrooms, other heartbreaks. Inside, beneath the glare of artificial lights and high ceilings that made men feel small, a trial unfolded that was never meant to exist. Nathan Claiborne sat at the defense table, clean-shaven, hair trimmed, suit pressed like any other man desperate to look respectable before judgment. But the mask had long since slipped. The room saw him now, not as a sheriff, not as a civil servant, but as an architect of disappearance, a curator of terror draped in the fabric of law. To his left sat the remnants of the machine, two deputies who had vanished the night Mabel returned, a local magistrate who once sealed falsified warrants with a casual shrug, even the coroner who had declared 3 missing black teens runaways without ever examining a body. Their faces betrayed nothing. Their eyes darted nowhere, as if the light of truth had turned them to stone. The charges came like hammer strokes, 3 federal indictments: conspiracy against civil rights, obstruction of justice, kidnapping under color of law. 6 civil charges: unlawful imprisonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, wrongful death facilitation, and more. Each naming a family, a face, a history once erased. But no blow landed harder than the one delivered not by the prosecution nor the gavel, but by the woman who stood to speak before sentencing, Mabel Harper. She walked slowly to the podium, her yellow dress traded now for a plain navy suit. No makeup, no performance, just presence and memory. She did not read from notes, she didn't need to. "When I was a little girl," she began, "I asked my mother what happens when people disappear. She said, sometimes they don't disappear. Sometimes they're made invisible." The room went still. "For 10 years, this man," she said, glancing toward Claiborne without flinching, "made people like me invisible. He didn't just hurt bodies. He erased records. He silenced mothers. He rewrote death certificates. He made entire communities believe their mourning was a kind of madness." Somewhere in the gallery, a woman's soft sob broke free. Mabel continued, "But today is not about vengeance. It is not about making him suffer, because justice is not the mirror of pain. It is the preservation of memory." She paused, not to catch her breath, but to let the words settle. "We don't come here demanding blood," she said, her voice unwavering. "We come here demanding remembrance." She turned fully to face the courtroom, not just the judge, but the press, the spectators, the strangers watching from couches across America. "Let the world remember who you tried to erase." Silence flooded the chamber. Even the judge, a man known for stiff efficiency, remained quiet longer than necessary before nodding toward the bailiff. Sentencing was read without ceremony. Claiborne received the maximum, 32 years without parole across federal and civil penalties. Some said it wasn't enough. Others said it was unprecedented. But none could deny what it meant. It meant the silence had ended. Outside the courthouse, the air was electric. Cameras buzzed. Reporters shouted questions. Activists held portraits of the missing. Not grainy mugshots, but high school yearbook photos, wedding snapshots, family barbecues. Each face a ledger entry that Claiborne's system had tried to delete. But Mabel didn't stop for the cameras. She didn't raise a fist, didn't weep, didn't wave. She simply stepped out onto the courthouse steps and breathed, deeply, as if the weight of generations had pressed into her lungs and she was, for the first time, allowed to exhale. Ronan stood nearby, arm in a sling, his face bruised but watching her with a quiet respect that needed no words. Liana Reed hovered close, camera crew trailing her but didn't shove a mic in Mabel's face. She knew better. Some moments deserved stillness. From the top of the steps, Mabel looked not at the crowd but beyond it, toward the city, toward the horizon, toward every child whose name had been whispered in fear but would now be spoken in history. She didn't smile. She didn't have to. This wasn't closure. It was consequence. It began again in New York City, thousands of miles from the cliff, the cabin, the courthouse. This time, the spotlight wasn't aimed at Mabel Harper as a survivor or a headline. It was aimed at her as a voice, and not one screaming into chaos, but one steady, measured rising into clarity. The National Conference for Police Reform was held inside a repurposed theater in Harlem, an echo chamber of ideas, grief, and change, stitched together with tension. The room was packed with professors, activists, clergy, and victims who no longer used the word victim to define their past. Outside, rows of cameras waited like clocks, marking time until someone said something America wasn't ready to hear but needed to. Mabel, now 19, stood backstage in a simple blazer and jeans. No makeup. Her natural curls framed a face that no longer held shock but direction. Her fingers tapped the edge of the podium script, not for nerves but for rhythm. Her rhythm. Ronan stood off stage, his arm fully healed now but marked forever. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He was here not as protector or friend or symbol, but as witness. The moderator announced her name. Applause didn't roar. It bloomed, like something sacred. Mabel stepped forward and faced a room of people older than her, wearier than her, more educated than her, but none more awake than her. She didn't begin with the cliff, or the blood, or the gunshots. She began with breath. When I was 15, she said slowly, someone threw me off a cliff and expected silence to finish the job. Eyes narrowed, pens paused. The air grew still. But I'm not here to talk about the fall, she continued. I'm here to talk about what happens after you hit the ground. What happens when the world expects you to stay broken and you don't? Screens across the conference flickered with footage. Whitney Memorial's lockdown sign, the courthouse steps, Claiborne's mugshot, and finally the faces of those listed in the clean sheet file, people who never got to breathe this kind of air again. I spent my whole childhood hiding, Mabel said, not because I was afraid of who I was, but because they were. She paused. A ripple of realization moved through the crowd. If you've ever been taught to lower your voice, shrink your truth, survive instead of live, then you already know the system better than anyone teaching about it. In the second row, a woman clutched a photo of her son, shot in 2012, no charges ever filed. Mabel leaned closer to the microphone. This country doesn't fear chaos. It fears clarity. It fears the clarity of young black girls who don't die, don't disappear, and don't stay quiet. Then came the question. A small hand rose from the front row. A girl, maybe 9 years old, hair braided, freckles scattered across dark skin like stars in formation, looked up and asked, "Can someone like me ever become director of the FBI?" The room fell quiet, and for the first time all day, Mabel smiled. "You have to ask America," she replied, "because I know you can. The question is, will they let you?" She knelt beside the girl, holding her gaze. "But remember this, if they feared your voice, it means it matters." Applause swelled, not out of celebration, but recognition, the kind of applause that's half tribute, half vow. Later that night, Mabel sat alone on the theater steps. Ronan joined her, handing her a hot tea with honey and ginger. "You know," he said quietly, "that girl will never forget today." Mabel looked up at the Harlem skyline, its chaos held together by rhythm. "Good," she said, "because someday she might need to remember who she was before they tried to tell her otherwise." The next morning, she didn't catch a flight. She rented a car. No fanfare, no security detail, just the road and memory as her map. She returned to Whitney Memorial, not as a fugitive, not as a survivor, but as herself. The yellow wildflowers had returned along the roadside. The church sign read, "Truth Remains." A few residents watched from porches as her car pulled in. Some lowered their eyes, others nodded. One old woman placed a hand to her chest, then waved. Mabel parked, stepped out, walked down Main Street, and for the first time the ground didn't tremble beneath her. It held her. Inside the rebuilt community center, she sat at a table across from a young black boy flipping through a civics textbook. He looked up and asked, "Are you the lady from the news?" She smiled again, not out of pride, out of understanding. "I used to be." Outside, the sun broke through clouds not as absolution, but as invitation. Because justice wasn't the end of the story. It was the seed, and the soil had finally been turned. Red Rock Overlook was silent at dawn. No police tape, no cameras, no screams or sirens, just the sound of early wind tracing the edge of a cliff that once knew blood. Mabel stood alone at the same precipice where, not long ago, someone decided her life didn't belong in this world, that her voice was dangerous, that her existence was disposable. The wind kissed her skin. It didn't sting like it did that night. It carried something older now, something deeper than revenge, quieter than grief. It carried memory, and it carried choice. She walked slowly to the edge. No fear in her feet, no tremble in her breath, just purpose. The ground here was dry, fractured in places, still marked with boot prints from another life. But Mabel didn't study the earth for evidence. She wasn't here to prove a crime. The world already knew. She was here to remember. She knelt, knees pressing into the soil that once cradled the end of her innocence. She didn't cry. There were no tears left that served her. She pressed one palm into the dirt, closed her eyes, and breathed. For a long moment she said nothing. No internal monologue, no fury, no scripture or slogan, just silence. The kind she had once been buried in, the kind she had fought to rise from, the kind that now belonged to her. She had learned that survival was not the same as living, that justice, when delayed, takes on the flavor of fatigue, that anger, while righteous, was never the final form of healing, and so she released it, all of it, the ache of broken ribs and broken trust. The cold hours in a ravine counting stars like they were witnesses, the echo of Claiborne's voice, heavy with hatred, the hollow apology from systems that called it a mistake, gone. She whispered, to no one and to everything, "I didn't survive the fall. I survived the silence after, and that was the truth, because the world had expected her to remain trapped beneath the weight of that silence, to become one more case, one more photo, one more name that fades into the fog of American forgetting. But she didn't. She returned, not to haunt, but to heal. She stood, brushing her hands on her jeans. Her body bore no armor now, no bulletproof vest, no lawyer beside her, no father behind her, only herself. Taller than before, not because of what she endured, but because of what she reclaimed. This place, once the scene of an attempted erasure, was now the birthplace of something new. Not just accountability, not even justice, but history rewritten by the hands of those who refused to vanish. Mabel turned away from the cliff. She didn't look back. The past had already seen her. And as she walked down the slope, the first light of morning hit her shoulders, not as spotlight, but as affirmation. The warmth didn't ask if she was ready. It didn't ask if she forgave. It simply shone. Each step she took left no footprints, but the land remembered. A hawk circled above, silent as it soared, casting no shadow. Down below, the town of Whitney Memorial was just beginning to stir. Unsure of its future, but no longer able to deny its past. In some homes, children asked questions their parents couldn't answer. In others, names like Valerie Harper and the Clean Sheet began to replace false narratives written to protect the guilty. And at the church's bulletin board, someone had pinned a photo of Mabel, not as a victim, not even as a hero, but simply standing, alive. Whole, real. She kept walking. She had speeches to decline, interviews to skip, and stories to write on her own terms. There would be no memoir, no movie, not now, because this story wasn't ending. It was planting. She passed a field where wildflowers had returned, growing in crooked rows, unapologetically bright. Children would pick them in spring, unaware of the soil's memory, and that, too, was part of healing. She whispered to the air, "Let them forget the fall, but not the rising." A crow called once in the distance, then flew off alone. Mabel smiled softly, because she understood now. Being alone didn't mean being lost. She reached the foot of the overlook just as the sun cleared the horizon. Her shadow stretched long behind her, not ominous but proud, and as she stepped onto the paved road again, no longer running, no longer hiding, the story of the girl who didn't belong faded into something bigger. The girl who didn't fall. Not really, because gravity never had the final word. History did, and this time, history was being written by the one they tried to erase. She was thrown off a cliff, and left for dead, but rose to rewrite the system that tried to erase. Mabel didn't just survive. She transformed injustice into impact, silence into testimony, and pain into power. Her story is not just about what was taken, but what she reclaimed, for herself and for everyone they buried in the dark. In a nation that still trembles at a black girl's voice, she became the truth they couldn't mute. Where were you when America heard her speak? If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe for more powerful, true-inspired tales of justice, courage, and redemption. Let's keep their voices alive until every silence has its reckoning.